We are going to begin working on a wall texture map for the small building 1, very low resolution building, very low polygon count, so a fairly straightforward UV map. So we're just going to be working on the walls right now and then working on the roof separately. We're going to start by creating a custom brick texture, also using some photographic seamless textures. To create the brick, I want to start by creating a couple of custom patterns, and really these are just going to be vertical line patterns. And I want to start by using just a blank document, file new. I have a size just 1024 by 1024, which is the height of the image for the UV map. This is going to be the max size for a pattern we would really need to use, because beyond that we really wouldn't be using patterns anymore. So what I want to do is just create some vertical lines with a little bit of distortion in them, and I'm going to create just 2 patterns to start, and we can take a look in another new document after that. So what I want to do is type in a value of 8 pixels using the line tool. Switch over, just start with color black, and just kind of draw that out. You can right click on the layer and rasterize it, and switch to the move tool, V on the keyboard, holding down shift to constrain it, and you can also select the move tool from the toolbar. And I just want to create equal spacing between these lines, or fairly equal. It doesn't have to be perfect, because we do want a little bit of variation to it. And we're going to use this to kind of generate the in-between parts of the brick. And the next shape I'm going to make for the next pattern, I'm going to have to adjust the line size slightly, and that way it'll stay consistent. Go ahead and take a look. I'm going to move some of these lines over, just holding down shift and selecting those layers. And because I do have the line over here on the left, I don't need to worry about the one on the right, although I am going to select all of the layers except the background layer and just move those over slightly. You can create a copy, as I was before, holding down the Alt key and then moving the object will clone it. If you're holding down shift while you're doing that, it allows you to constrain it and just copy it over. You could also draw individual lines if you wanted it to be on one mask. And I'm going to choose not to use any sort of distortion at the moment for this pattern, and instead kind of apply more of a texturized look to these lines after I create the pattern and have most of the brick kind of laid out. So what I can do is just flatten, or select all the layers and merge down. Go to Layer, Flatten Image. Now we can hit Control A on the keyboard to select all, and then up in Edit we can define a pattern. So we're going to call this Brick 1, and I can go to the history and just undo the flatten image. We can turn off some of these lines, so we can just work with 1. And I'm going to scale this and make it slightly larger. Depending on the image interpolation type you have, if you hit Control K on the keyboard or go to Edit, preferences and any of the options under General, you have in Interpolation Type. This will define any sort of scaling, resizing, and also when you create or rasterize shape objects. And depending on the mode you're using, you can end up with different edges. So if you did want to have a completely sharp line, nearest neighbor will typically create that. It also has to do with how just the pixels are resampled in any sort of scaling overall. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just do the same thing I did before, holding on Alt and Shift, and just moving them. And these are going to be the smaller bricks. So I have the lines a little larger, and that way when it's scaled down, the pattern scaled down, it will pretty much mix with the other one, the other layer. Flatten the image, Control A, select all, edit, and go to Define Brush Pattern, or Define Pattern. We're going to call this Brick 2. So now we can generate or create a new layer, or a new document. And what I want to do is create a rectangle object, and just kind of draw it out, make the color white. Right click, we can rasterize it, and then I'm going to just draw it with the Marquee Tool. So M on the keyboard, or select the marquee, and just drag that out to create some just separations between this layer. So right click, we can transform the selection and hit enter, and that way we're just transforming the marquee. And what I can do is now delete some sections in between. Now because the shape layer is white, a little difficult to see that, so I'm going to go ahead and just go back to the Marquee Tool. We can deselect, and I'm going to paint in more of a base background of black. Go back to the Marquee Tool and just make that line once again. Transform selection, pull it out on the edges just to extend beyond the canvas, and then this makes it guaranteed that we're going to be deleting from that shape layer. So now we can go down and just delete some of these sections. You could also just do a couple of rows and then copy and paste those over later, kind of overlay the different layers. And those seem to kind of decline overall. So what we can do is just adjust the scale, Control T on the keyboard to free transform, and kind of drag that around. That'll give us a little more manipulation, a little more distortion. I'm going to go ahead and double click on the shape layer and select Pattern Overlay. Now from the pattern, so the last patterns we have are going to be the brick 1 and the brick 2. So what I can do is adjust the scale. And now we're seeing that first layer of bricks. Click OK. The background layer, we can double click and just hit enter. It's going to call it layer 0. Basically do the same thing, pattern overlay, and select that brick 2. And we can scale this down a lot smaller, and that way just kind of get some of those in-between bricks. And you could do this with multiple layers. It doesn't have to be just 2. And just adjust the pattern. If you need to create new patterns for this, you easily can. One thing we are missing is the vertical lines. So what we can do to create vertical lines is just turn on stroke. You really only need to do this with one layer, typically the top layer. and then you can adjust the size and other elements as well. I'm just going to have the stroke set to black. We could do a center, so if we want to go inside and outside, we'll go ahead and bring this down to 3, click OK. Maybe fine-tune that other one so that we don't have noticeable straight lines. And now we can see kind of a basic brick showing up. So if I wanted to, like I was saying, add some smaller bricks, we can make them a little more random too if we wanted. Just kind of create a new shape. We can rasterize the layer now, double click on it, pattern overlay, move it over to one of these bricks. Let's use that second pattern. We can scale this down much further, turn on the stroke, basically same settings as before. And now if we hit V on the keyboard for the move command, we can move some of these around. And because I have that extra scale outside the more noticeable work area, I can shift it left and right in order to add a little variance so it's not as obvious of a repeating texture. We can do the same thing with those first couple of layers we created. So I'm going to make a copy, just dragging it over the button right next to the trash can. Just selecting the layer, holding it down, doing that will create a copy. You could also use that Alt along with the move in order to do that. And I'm going to hit Control T to free transform this. Now the pattern is going to stay the same in this case. So we can scale this left and right without any really obvious differences. And then if we want to move up part of this, we can see where the bottom is showing, just so that it's not all the way the same throughout the map. We don't want to have any really small brick layers, so you might want to pay attention a little to some of the overlaps to make sure that it looks alright. If you need to, you can scale up or down. Just Control T for free transform, or you can go to let's see here, up in Edit, free transform. So now that background layer, I'm going to make a copy of that because I do want to cut out maybe 1 or 2 sections. So we'll just draw out with the Marquee Tool, just delete a section out, and then we can go to the layer just underneath it in the original, pattern overlay, and just modify the scale just a little. It doesn't have to be a huge variance, but just enough to get rid of some of those weird looking overlaps. If we go to the bottom layer too, we can free transform it, scale it, and then move it in order to modify a little bit more. If I need to, I can delete the Marquee Tool, some more sections from layer 0, and the duplicate of that background layer. And then go back to the base layer and the bottom layer. Just kind of move that around. And now, because I did make those cuts, I will need to turn on stroke for the duplicate of the bottom layer. You can turn it on and off if you want to see the difference. And then we could also free transform the duplicate layer and move that around. So we'll go ahead and start with that for the brick. We can modify the other layers if needed, just kind of shifting them slightly. And we can free transform if needed. And once that's done, if you want to save out this current document, so you can go back, maybe reuse it again, make modifications to it if needed, save it out separately, because we are going to be flattening this overall document. And I just want to call this brick template. Save the layers. I'm not going to save a color profile with it. And then I'm going to save it again and just call it brick underscore flatten. And then what I can do is just go ahead and flatten the image, and now we have the brick. If you need to make some larger lines for some of those other bricks, you could create new patterns. I'm going to be severely manipulating this. It was just kind of get to the basic shape and the overall pattern of the brick, and it should be horizontally seamless as well. So if we go to Filter, Other, and Offset, we can turn off vertical and adjust the horizontal offset, and it should be pretty much seamless because we only made vertical lines. So that way we can tile it left and right across the building walls and not have to worry about doing any extra touch-up work. So we can use a couple of different filters, or quite a few filters, to distort the brick a little more. I am going to create a duplicate of this layer, the background layer, before I make any modifications, just so I can come back and do other manipulations to the other layer and then kind of overlay them. A lot of different things you could do. There's really no exact way to do this. So I am going to select Filter, Texture, and Texturizer. And this is the filter gallery, where we can perform a variety of different filters to really manipulate that layer. There's quite a few you can choose from to get some very interesting effects. I'm going to expand the distort. You can also apply multiple filters within this as well, which is pretty nice. So adding different layers, and you can turn them on and off. I'm going to go to glass, and we can choose a couple of different textures and adjust the distortion, the smoothness of the distortion. We want it to be kind of a medium smoothness. We don't want too many breaks between the bricks, but we do want to have a good amount of variation to make it look realistic. You can adjust the scaling. You can invert it, basically the mesh displacement that's kind of distorting the image. And you could try the different textures to see which is going to look best. I'm going to use the frosted. And click OK. We don't need to use a whole lot with this. It does look a little pixelated. So I'm going to have to perform some other filters to make it look a little bit better. For the most part, the image should take care of that. But if I need to do a surface blur, filter, blur, surface blur, we should be able to kind of smooth that out. And we can just use a smaller radius and then just modify the threshold level in order to basically fine-tune the area in which we are blurring. And then the total blur amount is based on the radius. And then adjusting the threshold chooses to which range or size of the elements that we are affecting. So I'm going to bring that up a little bit more, click OK, and then hit Control L on the keyboard to bring up levels. Just select Auto, adjust the slider and the central slider to the right or left to increase or decrease the effect of the filter after it's already been applied. And that also allows for some pretty nice overlays to use as masks, blends between different textures. Because the pixel blocks are so obvious, I do want to use under noise, filter noise, reduce noise. And we can blur those pixel blocks by turning up the strength all the way to 10 and using a percent of 3 or lower. So 3, it's still going to leave most of the block. 2, it's going to really start to blur them a little bit more. And 0 is going to really smooth those out. And I also want to turn off the sharpen details. We can turn off reduce color noise, but that's really going to help. So we can click OK. Now using these two filters can sometimes cause problems if you have basically a vertical line, in this case right on the edge, and that might cause it to no longer be seamless. So we'll go ahead and take a look using the offset filter, and we can see a little bit of a seam. There is a way to prevent that from happening, and really what you have to do is increase the size of the overall canvas. And let's just go ahead and do that really quick. Go to the history and turn off that reduce noise, or delete it from the history. And we're going to first crop, just to make sure that everything is deleted on the outside. So just drag from left to right. Make sure that the cropped area is set to delete and not hide, otherwise it will just reduce canvas size rather than deleting the layer. Now what we can do is go to canvas size, and we have 1024 by 1024 for the total height. We really only need to go 50% larger than that. So let's set it to 50, or total size 150 for the width and the height. Click OK. This gives us an extra canvas area, and what we can do, and we really only have to do it to this background 2 or the copy, is create a duplicate, and I'm going to go up to View and Snap to, and just make sure that document bounds is turned on, and pretty much everything, and turn on Snap. And then when we create a copy, now in this case, because of the way this is designed, this current texture won't perfectly work for this vertically. But this is the same process for a seamless texture, horizontal, vertical. You don't need to add the extra vertical canvas space for the height if you're just working with a horizontal tileable texture. In this case, I just want to show you how you would do this with a fully seamless texture. So what we can do is just basically hold on Alt and Shift just to create a copy, and then snap it to the bottom. And then we can take all 3 of these layers, merge them, and then move it all the way to the left and to the right, creating duplicates along the way. And then we can merge all of those together. And now run that filter. So we can go to Noise, Reduce Noise, same settings, click OK. And after that's done, go to Canvas Size and just change it back to where it was before, 1024 by 1024. Click OK. Proceed with clipping, and now we have it where it's going to be tileable again without any huge changes and no seams showing up, because we added the extra information to the side to calculate the surface blur throughout, so it doesn't just cut off, because otherwise that data isn't part of the image. So the surface blur doesn't know to blur outside of the canvas. So that's a really useful technique, because surface blur is really nice for creating different types of maps. You can also run that as an action. So if you have the automation and the ability to use actions, you can record a new action doing that process, where you copy it up, copy it down, canvas size and everything, all the crops, and that way you can run it over and over again. The only thing is you do have to set it based on the pixel size of the image. So it would be something you would use consistently through, in this case, an image that's 1024 by 1024. So if you're doing a sequence of textures where you're going to be using a surface blur and they're seamless, then it's really easy to just set up an action for it. And I've done that before for generating lots and lots of normal maps, where I had to use surface blur quite a bit. So I'm now going to load in one of the textures I've included. It's as effects concrete number 67. It looks like this. Just a very kind of generic seamless texture. And I'm just going to go ahead and select all and copy, and then paste it onto the new document. You can also right-click, duplicate the layer, and select the document you want to duplicate it to. So now what we can do is use an overlay. So put this underneath that brick we set up. And actually, before I run the levels, I'm going to make another copy of it, just turn it off, because I do want to have some different adjustments I can use. Right now I want to kind of create more of the finer lines, some of the harsher details. And you can see that some of the really small bricks are starting to disappear, and that's because I didn't really create a pattern for bricks that small. So definitely keep that in mind, that you will need to adjust any custom patterns to match the overall or the end scale. So now I have that adjustment made. We could use something like multiply and then reduce the opacity of that layer. I don't think that's really going to look all that great. So one thing you do is saturation can be pretty interesting. But we would need to use basically the same layer as a mask in itself to only affect certain areas. So what we could do is select this layer of the brick, Control A and copy, and then down here in the bottom we can select to add a mask to the layer, and then with the channels window open, so window channels, you can turn on that new mask that just has shown up and then paste it, and then it's going to show a red outline. And then what you can do is just click off of the mask layer. Now we can minimize that. We can see that it is in reverse what I want at the moment, although you could easily stick with it this way to have more color on the lines, but I do want it the other way around. So I'm going to select that mask, which is the layer right next to the current one, and we can hit Control I, which is going to invert it. And that way we can just reduce the color on that mask. This also gives us the ability to run a layer style. So I can double click on the layer. We could use something like drop shadow, turn off the distance, increase size, and spread, adjust the opacity amount. And what's happening is that the grit on the bricks, or the fine details, are still showing within that grout. So if you also want to use this layer to mask another texture, instead of just these lines, we could do that as well. Also, a shift in the original texture would work. So let's make a copy. And I'm going to go to Filter, Other, Offset, and just add a little bit of offset. And then I'm going to select Control-Shift-U if I want to fully desaturate the image. Or we can go to Image Adjustments and select the black and white. This will allow us to fine-tune which areas are going to convert to which grayscale and the overall contrast of the image. So you can also select the individual elements with an eyedropper, move them over, which will automatically select the color it's linked to. This way you can just create a little more of a modification. So I'm going to keep this on normal and just drag the mask onto this duplicate, and also right click, copy the layer style, and paste it. And now it shouldn't be matching up, but we do need to make sure that we increase the opacity, because otherwise what's going to happen is we're going to use the opacity from the other layer and also the layer style. So we do want to set that to a different blend. We can set it to normal, or we could use something else, color burn, soft light, if we wanted to lighten it up. And there's quite a few different effects we could use. But setting it to normal is going to be the best way to get rid of that consistent grit. Now you don't have to use the same texture. You can use, of course, any of them. I do want to go back and show you with creating another duplicate of that original pattern, selecting or hitting Control L for levels, and just bring down the left point and then the central point in order to kind of create that variation. Now you can see, because we used the reduced noise, it's becoming very smooth overall, more rounded. So if you did want to go back to more the block style, we can go back to that original background layer, make a copy, and it may be slightly different. For the most part, it looks the same. It doesn't have that distortion though, so whether or not we'll be able to pull out the same elements, we'll need to rerun the filter. So I'm just going to go back to that texture we were using before, or the distortion of the glass. Click OK, and we should be able to get something fairly similar once we run the surface blur over it again with less of a threshold. Don't want to affect as much. And if you want to do this with that extended canvas to prevent any seams, we could also set that up. So now we can create those more square bricks, and now we could use this as a mask as well. Or even just setting it to multiply, and then increasing the opacity. Just add a little more variation. I mean, there's a lot you can do with it. You don't have to necessarily do these specific actions. We could also run another filter over it, or fine-tune the overall output, maybe make it a little bit thicker. But there's a lot of different ways to create custom textures. So this is kind of our brick. Make a few more modifications to it with the color, just so we don't have exactly the same thing. I do want to set that just back to saturation for now. And instead of adjusting the opacity, I do want to just modify the fill. Reducing the fill layer is just the texture itself. That keeps the effects, like our drop shadow, intact, which is tied to the opacity. So if I want, I could also run a pattern or something like that to remove some of that extra distortion. But for the most part, we have a usable brick as a starting point to work with some of the other textures. I do want to modify the saturation of the original color, because I don't want this to be so orange, and too much in the reds. If you're using Photoshop CS4, a great filter is vibrance. You can reduce vibrance and increase saturation, or decrease saturation, increase vibrance, to get a nice realistic looking tone. Very rarely will you end up going in the same direction with these sliders, but it's really nice, especially if we're working with textures like this. If you don't have access to this version of Photoshop, you can just use the hue and saturation, which is Control U, and then just decrease saturation. That, along with brightness and contrast, can produce a similar result, and a little bit of levels as well. So we can adjust the levels of this. If I click on Auto, we're really going to get something interesting now, where it's mostly desaturated, along with some nice little color splotches showing. And I might need to really remove that grit now. For the most part, we can work with this.